And I think the way to kick off our conversation, Jamal, is from a piece that you wrote, which I read quite thoroughly, and it was quite interesting. And it's entitled "While America Boasts Being the Richest and Most Powerful Country in the World," and then it has three little periods. And you connect in the beginning the deaths of 34 children attending Bronx public schools, and you connect that a little bit later in the piece to the fact that we have corporate greed that has dictated federal policy on things like Citizens United, the repeal of Glass-Steagall, tax breaks, and so on. And so, in some way, it's this micro, based a lot on your experience as an educator, as a teacher and a principal, to the macro big picture. So, I want you to riff a little bit about that and tell us a little bit how you see those connections.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to frame it. I think our policy at the federal level and how our elected officials have been compromised and co opted by corporations and the wealthy elite that some call the oligarchy, I think that relationship has created policies that have suppressed and oppressed the masses of people, regardless of race, regardless of religion, regardless of gender. And I think because of that oppression, you see a sense of hopelessness and despair and suffering and apathy throughout the masses, which I think has led to a rash of issues related to mental health issues, destroyed family dynamics, destroyed community dynamics. And you see much of the manifestation as an educator within the public school system. So when you have a society where children are killing children and children are killing each other, there's something terribly wrong with that society. So for me, it's about, okay, what are the government policies and what are the things that are coming from the top, if you will, in creating a society in which children are so depressed and oppressed and feeling horrible about their existence that they will want to kill other children and even themselves. So all politics are local, and everything that happens locally is connected to what happens on the national level.
So you mentioned about depression, and certainly that's true in my experience with adults and people who simply don't want to vote. I have less experience, obviously, because I'm not a teacher at the school level. Do you have an example of something that happened where you were talking to a kid in your school or maybe in another school or as you've been door knocking that kind of illustrates that depression among children?
Well, throughout my experience, I've been an educator for 20 years and I've been a school principal for the past 10 years. Throughout my experience, I can't even count the number of students who have been in my office exhibiting suicidal ideation at ages as young as 11 years old. I can't even count the number of experiences of children in my office who, after a short interview and some conversation about family and what's going on in the community, have lifted up their shirts and shown scars from self mutilation. Our society, through media, through literature, and through other means, teaches our children that they are not worthy of a certain status if they don't exhibit a certain hairstyle or skin color or gender or orientation. And our children internalize this stuff from a young age. And because of that, they show all signs of mental illness and mental difficulties that unfortunately, because our schools are not fully funded and because we invest more in police than we do counselors, children continue to suffer throughout their school experience. So again, these social issues are connected to policy that comes directly from Washington.
And you hit on a point that I wanted to raise because of your experience as an educator about the question of schools being fully funded. And I have been in the labor movement my whole adult life. And one of the things that, as you know, as an educator, that has happened is that the society, partly driven by conservatives, has blamed teachers often for the decline in education or the way in which our kids are not educated. And I always thought that was really just malarkey, that in fact, if you eliminated the Defense Department or cut it back by half and took some of those billions of dollars and invested them in schools, then you could lift up those schools. You could actually give books to kids. You wouldn't have crumbling schools. But one of the things I noticed, you may agree with that part, but one of the things I noticed was you actually focus a lot on the, if you will, the mental state of schools, the way in which we treat kids and we punish them as opposed to try to work with them on their issues. So tell me how much of this is about the racism in schools, the classism, the lack of money, or is it just an emotional thing that we have to fix?
Well, it's all of the above. So, a couple of things. One, our schools are rooted in an assembly line ideology. Our schools were designed in the 19th century for a 19th century economy, right? An economy that was giving birth to the Industrial Revolution, where you graduated from schools and kids worked in the assembly line. We still move kids through school by batches based on grade, based on age. The schools are still designed by subject matter, if you will. We're doing this in the United States in our public schools to prepare kids to be worker bees for an elite class. Whereas in other countries like Finland, like Singapore, and many others, kids are learning focused on project based learning. Kids are focused on 21st century skills, collaboration, cooperation, creativity. Kids are focused on the things that's going to prepare them for 21st and 22nd century Green New Deal economy. So we're behind the eight ball when it comes to that in our public schools. Now, by contrast, in our public schools in wealthy communities or in our private schools, those kids are learning what they need to learn to be leaders in the 21st century, as opposed to public school kids that are learning to work for the leaders. And let me just add one point. You mentioned racism. So redlining, where black and brown people weren't allowed to buy homes in certain communities because of their race, and as a result were forced into housing projects and into areas of concentrated poverty. They weren't able to build wealth because of this. But in addition to that, their schools were funded at a lower rate because much of school funding comes from local property taxes. So that's how racism is embedded into the system. Property taxes fund schools. If you're white, you're allowed to live in certain areas where black people and brown people were not allowed to live. Therefore, for the last few decades, your schools have been funded at a higher rate. So there's a variety, as you mentioned, of racial issues, class issues, but ideological issues that we need to deal with when it comes to our public schools.
And you're right that there's a tremendous amount of redlining that goes on. There's inherent racism that we find not just in schools, but in jobs and throughout our society. It's been endemic for decades. And it kind of circles back then to the question of essentially priorities, where we spend our money. And that's a good way of bringing up your opponent, who is a corporate Democrat and has been for years. And the first thing that I actually want to focus on is the notion that because this fellow has not really been engaged in what the district needs, the questions of schools and funding and racism, really people don't know who the heck Elliot Engel is. And only 9%, and this actually blew me away because I didn't know it was this low, only 9% of the people voted in the 2018 primary. So talk a little bit about that in terms of just the practicality of as you build your campaign. I assume that a lot of that is just simply knocking on doors and telling people about the issues and about who you are.
You know, people have been looking for a viable candidate, viable competitor to Elliot Engel for years. And this is the first time in a long time they have a candidate that is viable. And I'm not talking about myself as a candidate. I'm talking about myself and the movement that has taken place in this district and across the country. People understand that people like Democrats like Congressman Engel have been complicit in creating the environment that allowed a pathway to Donald Trump to exist. So it's because people like him have been in office for 30 years. They haven't been leaders on any real progressive issues. They haven't been bold despite existing within blue district. And therefore, again, corporations have come in and co-opted the environment and the values. And now we've created a pathway to Donald Trump. So he's as responsible for Donald Trump being in office as anyone else. You mentioned only turning out about 9% of the electorate, and there's some data that shows it may have been less than that. You mentioned parts of the district where we have 20%, a poverty rate above 20%. We have an obesity epidemic. We have an asthma epidemic. We have an infant mortality epidemic. We have parts of the district where rent burdens are as high as 57%. Parts of the district where they have power plants where children are inhaling fossil fuels at disproportionate rates. And then we have other parts of the district where you have tremendous wealth, some of the most wealthiest homes and communities in the country. So it's a tale of two districts in the same way America is economically divided, and it's a tale of two classes. And he has led in certain parts of the district on certain issues while neglecting the majority of the district. And that's just unacceptable, particularly in this day and time, the day and time of Trump, the day of time of young people demanding more when it comes to environment, demanding more when it comes to immigration reform, demanding more when it comes to ending the forever wars. Our young people want more. People of color want more. The progressive movement wants more. And that's why they're open to a leadership like ours and the Justice Democrats.
And let me be very specific about the ways in which Elliot Engel is going against what should consider a progressive agenda, and certainly in a district that is largely Democratic or has a large Democratic majority, a large Democratic trend. As the district goes, it's plus what, 15 or something like that at least, right?
I think plus 24 or
Plus
something.
24, much more. I guess I
Yeah,
was thinking about it different.
there are no Republican challengers in this district. A Republican challenger would not have a chance to win in this district.
And so let me tick off the ways in which he's harming actually the people in that district. He supported the war in Iraq, which cost this country not just the lives of many people who served overseas and the injuries, the horrible injuries that they've suffered in the war, and now we are taking care of them or trying to take care of them as they come back. The cost of that. He supported the war in Iraq, which meant that there were billions of dollars not available to, for example, rebuild schools. He helped loosen the regulations on Wall Street, which lets the Wall Street financiers, the greedy people on Wall Street, essentially abuse lots of working people and certainly those people in the district. And he voted for the 1994 crime bill, which led to mass incarceration, which, as you well know, has affected people not just in your district, but in many black and brown districts. So those are just three areas where certainly Engel can be challenged on whether he represents the district, right?
100%. He voted against the Iran deal that Obama supported and most Democrats supported, and many people believe kept us out of war with Iran. He voted for No Child Left Behind, which led to the privatization of public schools, attacks on teachers' unions, and the proliferation of charter schools. And all of his money comes from corporate PACs, big pharma, big real estate, weapons manufacturers. We made more money from individual contributions in 48 hours after our launch than he did for the entire election cycle. So he's the classic paper progressive, corporate Democrat who, again, has worked. If you want to make that argument, some might make that argument, has worked for a long time, but definitely not in this day and age. And as I mentioned before, complicit in creating the environment that led to someone like Donald Trump becoming president.
Yeah, you mentioned the Iran deal, the deal that Obama negotiated. I was not a big fan of Barack Obama's foreign policy in many respects, but that deal, you could say, as you pointed out very correctly, probably at least strived to push off the potential for armed conflict with Iran for potentially a decade or more. He voted against that, which leads me to asking you about your view about the Israel-Palestine issue, because one of the things that particularly I thought was horrendous on the part of Engel, and I think is out of step with the district, he has been a mouthpiece for the right-wing governments in Israel and has been avowedly on the side of Israel's policies, which has oppressed the Palestinian people. What's your position on that?
There are humanitarian violations taking place in Palestine. There's no doubt about it. And to your point, Engel has been complicit in supporting the right wing government in Israel and committing this oppression. Now, let's be very clear. It's important to make sure people of Jewish faith are protected and safe and secure wherever they are, not just in Israel, but all over the world. But it's also important for us to hold that government accountable for its right wing oppressive policies towards the Palestinians. And I would also add that I believe the behavior of the Israeli government leads to the long term lack of safety of the Israeli people, because we will continue to embolden the Palestinian people and others to possibly take a violent approach towards the Israeli people, which we do not want. And this is not just about the relationship between Israel and Palestine. We also have to look at our relationship with Saudi Arabia and how Saudi Arabia treats the people of Yemen and the people within that region. We also have to look at America's complicity in Central America, in parts of Africa, and how we as a nation have been engaged in military conflict for 93% of our existence. It's important for us to talk about the military industrial complex very honestly, the trillions of dollars and the hundreds of thousands of lives that have been lost because of our military industrial complex. And again, as you mentioned, let's focus on people over power and profits and invest in life as opposed to investing and supporting death via war.
So my last question for you is this. So you're running for office. I believe this is the first time you've run for at least a federal office. And I wonder if you can tell us something that has surprised you in your campaign, something that you didn't expect, maybe also a difficulty, a challenge, because let's face it, running for office is a really hard thing to do. I've done it myself, and it is a real burden, especially if you've got a family and you have other interests. It really absorbs your whole life. So what's it been like? What has been your experience running for office?
Great question. It's a huge challenge because the more time I spend campaigning, the less time I spend with my wife and children and my family. And I absolutely love spending time with my wife, children, and family. So that's a huge sacrifice there. In addition, I'm still working full time. So I'm working full time and I'm running for office full time. So my days start very early, they end very late. My weekends are booked. And that's the price you pay, particularly when big money's controlling politics, because you have to compete with millionaires who are trying to win congressional seats. But the thing that I think has surprised me to a certain extent, I've been really inspired by people's involvement in our democracy throughout the country. There's so many people who want to help, who want to give, who want to volunteer, who want to be a part of really truly making our country greater than it's ever been. So that's a surprise, but it's also incredibly inspiring where you have people from all over the country who've never met me, just heard my story and want to give $5, a dollar, $10, $20, whatever they can to support me because they're not here to volunteer. And the fact that we've had hundreds of volunteers sign up who are canvassing constantly, who are who are phone banking constantly, and it's given me more faith in the American people, more faith in our democracy, more faith in our Constitution. And I'm just blessed to be a part of that.